It's wonderful to be part of a panel that is discussing modernism, and all three participants are talking about the West. Of course, one of the great bastions of modernism in Canada, and sort of regional, so it's sort of interesting. Anyway, I'll move right along. The Winnipeg sculptor Eva Stubbs does not think that she makes feminist art. Yet, as one of my colleagues recently remarked, her work somehow seems to open to a feminist reading, even while it does not explicitly reflect a political consciousness of what it means to be a woman in a patriarchal culture, which is what Harmony Hammond sort of defined in 1984 as one of the criteria for feminist art, or provide a privileged criticism of economic and social power relations and some commitment to collective action, which is Martha Rosler's criterion from 1977. Stubbs doesn't, at least first glance, appear to do that. However, just as feminism must concern itself with some concept of women as a group prior to the formation of self-conscious feminist politics, as Iris Marion Young has noted, feminist art history does well to concern itself with more than just art that is already recognizably feminist. In this paper, I will argue that the art of Eva Stubbs allows a feminist interpretation to occupy and incorporate it. After tracing Stubbs' modernist roots and outlining the challenges that such roots present for feminism, I will draw on Young's notion of gender as seriality to uncover a feminist significance to Stubbs' kiln-fired ceramic sculpture. I will show the way in which her work, through its dependence on piece molds, plaster piece molds, articulates the female body as it forms a site of personal private experience and the object of rule-bound socio-structural relations. Eva Stubbs de Coves was born in Budapest in 1925. During the Depression and through the Second World War, she and her Jewish family fled fascism's trailing fuse through Hungary, Germany, Spain, Italy, to Morocco. Tumultuous cultural acclimatization replaced turbulent geographical dislocation following the family's arrival in Winnipeg in 1944. Over her ensuing first decade in Canada, Stubbs married, had her first child, separated from her first husband, buried her father, and supported her family with odd jobs. While convalescing from tuberculosis in the late 1940s, she made the decision to study fine art, and in 1952, at the age of 27, and without previous training, she enrolled at the University of Manitoba's School of Art. I apologize for this. The bars are a copyright sort of thing, but I'll have you know that these are actually images that I took from the Winnipeg Art Gallery, the institution I work for, so it's somewhat embarrassing. Not all the images, just the ones taken from the WAG. The chair of the school's sculpture department, Cecil Richards, advocated a cautious modernism, reflecting an artistic pedigree tracing back to Rodin's pupil Carl Mills, for whom Richards had worked as a studio assistant. Filtered through a residual arts and crafts valorization of workmanship and an early modern truth-to-materials ethos, Richards appreciated sculpture with, in his words, humanistic qualities. He gave form to this humanism through mannered figures that, while often referencing mythical and religious themes, served more broadly to allegorize what's called the cosmic, as generalized avatars of entwined spiritual and natural processes. Eva Stubbs embraced both her teacher's modernism and his humanism. Pensive Mood from 1955, and Justice, as their titles suggest, are at once the personified projections of private associations and somehow generalized expressions of something universal. Through a series of exhibitions mounted at the Winnipeg Art Gallery in the 1950s, and I'm going to say probably about half a dozen, Stubbs also encountered firsthand the work of Henry Moore, Jack Lipchitz, Jacob Epstein, and Ossip Zadkine, which work you see here. The only work from those exhibitions that were actually subsequently made it back to the Winnipeg Art Gallery's collection, and that's part of our collection now. On occasion, as in Copper Mask from 1954, and The Night is Long, 1957, Stubbs' student work points beyond Richards toward these exemplars of international figurative and, one might say, humanistic modernism. The morphologies of anatomical distortion and fragmentation explored by these paragons of European avant-garde sculpture were in the 1940s and 50s often interpreted as memorial laments for the ethical wreckage of war. Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, identified Giacometti's emaciated figures as, quote, the fleshless martyrs of Buchenwald. They announced for the French philosopher not just an abstracted Promethean struggle for individual existential purpose, but more significantly, that struggle as faced here and now by what we call mankind as a whole. The distorted, punctured, and distended human form gave expression to the common tragedy of war. It gave static representation to the dislocation many, including Stubbs herself, of course, had experienced before, during, and following global conflict. However, as Julian Stahlbras has argued, associations between modernism's aesthetics of deformity and the trauma real bodies have endured in the arena of battle at places like Hiroshima and Buchenwald were fleeting. Haunted by the memory of war and facing the daunting task of economic and social reconstruction, as well as the specter of new mounted global standoffs, post-war governments and citizens, particularly those in Great Britain, yearn for signs of international stability. Ironically, in their articulation of human brutality, modern figurative sculpture succeeded in serving as a cultural monument to a unified and what Richards might have called cosmic humanity. This yearning for stability was often as much about looking back to a place that was utopian in the past as forward to a secure and unfolding future. In the 1952 address, Henry Moore upheld artists of pre-industrial societies as having enjoyed a universal faith in the unified structure within which they practiced, which he contrasts to what John C. Welchman described recently as, quote, the fragmentation and specialization of the modern age that alienates artists from this universalism. In the post-war era, modernist figuration came to be seen as articulating a transnationalist agenda, wrested from the historical present and supported by notions of humanist and abstract universalism. The specific traumatic memory wrought by a particular war was ameliorated through the reconception of humanity as unified, not through shared historical experience, but by a universal and transhistorical essence. Semiotic recalibration of modern figuration in the post-war era was at once obscured and aided by the interpretive speculations of Jungian or analytical psychology. To the already circulating idea that art bears witness to the individual's unconscious, Jungian psychology conjoined the idea of an underlying and unfathomable code for a collective and universal psychic unconscious. The application of Jungian principles to the generalized figures that populated the youth of artists like Moore helped to articulate post-war humanist universalism. Such application was supported by the fact that modernist figurative sculpture, through both titular designation and physical hue, was acutely and heteronormatively gendered. The maternal body received particular attention from both artists and Jungians at the time. For Eric Newman, a student of Jung, Moore's sculpture of reclining women and mothers with children signified, quote, the primordial feminine, the archetype of creation, the transhistorical psychic principle that makes all instantiations of human creativity, including works of art, at once possible and consequential. The mother and child theme was also rehearsed in the war and post-war practices of Lipschitz, Epstein, and Zadkine. Beyond luring Jungian interpretation, the modern representation of the maternal body equally served as a key input of social recuperation, consensus, and collective individuation. After her graduation in 1957 and through the 1960s, Stubbs' attention was increasingly directed towards supporting herself and her family. She taught high school and spent several years, actually here in Montreal, before remarrying and returning to Winnipeg in 1965. It was not until the mid-1970s that she re-engaged in full-time studio practice, in tracing her creative re-emergence through works such as Mother and Child of the Bird, which you see here, Mother and Child, Mother with Child, the Silent Voices series, which you see a selection of here, Standing Figures, Equilibrium, and Gaia, we witness significant material and thematic shift within her practice. Modeled kiln-fired clay replaces direct carving in stone and wood. Stubbs' greater focus on the full female figure, some standing, totemic, and unencumbered, others reclined, enclosed, and confined, echoes the very subject matter that had reverberated throughout the practices of her mid-century mentors. Given historical timing, this being the late 70s, early 80s, one might want to interpret Stubbs' turn to kiln-fired clay as a rejection of modernism, or postmodern aesthetic pluralism. But this is not necessarily so, for while ceramic had become, by the late 1960s, a poignant signifier of irreverence toward the hierarchical elevation of art over craft, this was not Stubbs' association. She had been introduced to working in kiln-fired clay by none other than Cecil Richards, and figures within European modernism, such as Paul Valéry, have long celebrated ceramic for the way in which its temperamental technique reveals, quote Valéry, close combat between man and form. Very modernist sensibility. Indeed, insofar as Stubbs appears to attack the clay, as a commentator described it, one might say that she simply transposed a modernist truth materials ethos into ceramic. But this characterization is not quite correct either. The working process Stubbs began developing in the late 1970s, particularly her innovative use of piece molds, prevents us from merely reading her work as a rehashed figurative modernism. Stubbs' working method begins with an original, but ultimately abandoned modeled clay figure, from which she derives and takes a series of plaster piece molds. Sometimes the piece mold encompasses the whole figure, sometimes parts of the figure, depending on how large the figure is. The molds provide the template from which to produce ceramic serialized versions of the original. However, she strives for variation between ceramic iterations, not consistent replication. She manipulates the surface of each work in a series, applying ad hoc incisions and painterly marks in the oxide, saying, before committing a piece to the kiln. Firing causes further irregularities to manifest between forms, unpredictably shrinking and warping the clay differently from one token to another. Moreover, as ambitious large-scale works like Standing Figures, this is an installation shot for Memories for the Future, and Multiples demonstrate, she does not so much rely on the piece molds to increase commercial output, but as a means to constructing multi-component figures as well as multi-figured sculptural installations. Throughout her mature practice, Stubbs references the full female figure, the maternal body. The artist has had personal reasons to invoke the subject matter in the 1980s and 90s. As a mature artist, Stubbs experienced the death of her mother, birth of her second child, and she became a grandmother. She became interested in representing ancestry, those are ancestry quotes, and particularly the emergence and passing of matrilineal generations. We thus do not necessarily require the abstractions of Jungian psychology to understand the artist's fascination with the maternal body. Moreover, that Stubbs' production process is rooted in piece mold seriality is a concrete factor that resists what I would say is the essentialist undercurrent of early mid-century modern figurative sculpture. The controversy surrounding essentialism, particularly the premise that there exist, as Alison Stone describes it, properties that are necessary to women, exposed a dilemma for feminism. We want and need to describe women as a group, and importantly, as a group prior to the formation of self-conscious feminist politics, political philosopher Iris Marion Young has insisted. But this very want and need always threatens to become normalizing and essentialist, insofar as it privileges specific forms of femininity and risks isolating issues of gender from categories of difference that distinguish women, such as class, race, class, age, sexuality, and ethnicity. And of course, our keynote speaker made that point as well. Yet the inability to talk about women collectively also forecasts ethical and political paralysis. If gender is merely one within a fluid plurality of equally significant identity categories, why should it be privileged as the site of political organization and action? Young sees the Sartrean distinction between group and series as the key to the possibility of making non-essentialist, positive claims about the way social life is and ought to be for women. The problem with essentialism, as Young sees it, resides in the premise that women are originally unified as self-conscious and a propulsive group association. That gender identity is already constituted by an a priori ability to ratify a list of the universal attributes or experiences that women share. She proposes instead that we understand gender as referring to a social series. Serialized experience of being gendered, she writes, is precisely the obverse of mutual recognition and positive identification of oneself as in a group. As an individual obtains series identity, an individual obtains series identity unintentionally and passively through participation within a pre-existing milieu of rule-bound behaviors, objects, and routinized practices, or what Sartre called practical inert realities. Commuters on a highway or people queuing for a bus represent series, not groups, because their solidarity depends on nothing more than the specific rules that bracket and condition what are otherwise their individual pursuits. Women, in Young's view, have a sense of shared identity as a result of social chorality. They exist as a series insofar as they are led to appear and perform against and within an already they are a set of material things and collective habits through body, speech, act, dress, and even space, she notes. The background that lends any particular act or practice its meaning. Events such as pregnancy, childbirth, lactation, menstruation for young do not simply reflect biological processes. They locate women within a series. And it is not only that these processes constitute series identity, but that the social rules that accompany them, which constitute the activity within which, I'll read that one again. And it is not only that these processes constitute series identity, but the social rules that accompany them, which constitutes the activity within which women live as serialized. Put another way, in Mika Ball's terms, women live different lives from men, not because they are different, but because they are confined in difference, because they find themselves confronting different practical inert realities. I think we can see Eva Stubbs' mature ceramic work as displaying a serial understanding of gender identity, and thereby as providing a means of reimagining feminist engagement with or unfolding of modernism. It is importantly an ambivalent sense of identity, at once deadening and hope-inspiring, as Young's serialized condition. Stubbs' figures are unified in a deflationary, depersonalized, and atomized way through their common origin in plaster molds. Her figures are not locked in a shared sphere of being by the ordered regularity that underpins their construction. The maternal body is Stubbs' preoccupation not because it exhibits essential cosmic or primordial significance, but rather because it is the site of collective, rule-bound, serial identity. At the same time, serial unity in Stubbs' work does not simply imply arid numerical repetition or replication. Stubbs' figures hint metaphorically at the potential for the serialized condition to lead to heightened forms of collaboration, to groups as self-conscious collectives of persons with a common objective that they pursue together. In Stubbs' work, the original play form, borrowing Briony Fair's phrase, is not just suspended but suppressed. While reflecting a shared origin instead of common piece molds, the individual experience of Stubbs' play forms in the fires of the kiln transform each sculpture or sculptural fragment into a discrete and varied object. Each figure goes on about its own business, as it were, but simultaneously within the serialized context, as if to show that the serial unity does not exclude potential for goal-setting self-consciousness. Thank you.